Leadership Aperture, challenging a leader to say, okay, how much information are you letting into your system? How curious are you being in this moment? How open to the other person's perspective? If you're sitting there holding the notion that you have the right answer to whatever problem we're trying to solve, that's a pretty narrow aperture. Because what if I have an answer that's slightly better than yours? Or what if neither of us have the right answer and it's actually unknown to both of us? Like that's a widening of the aperture, right? So yeah, I do think Leadership Aperture explains a lot.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the podcast. My name is Pete Steinberg. I'm the author of Leadership Shock. And this is the podcast series associated with my book that focuses on the authentic leadership model and the approach of helping leaders through their transitions on their career. We're actually going to talk today about something a little bit different, and I'm going to have a special guest, Mike Herzog, who is the president of the Telos Institute. The Telos Institute is an organization I have worked with a lot, and Mike and I have been partners in helping leaders at organizations be more effective. And so, Mike, welcome to Leadership Shock, the podcast.
Hey, Pete, thanks for having me, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I am also talking to Mike, who has published 2 books before me. And so you're going to find that Mike and I have some lively discussions and sometimes disagree. And I think that's going to be hopefully something that we're going to do today. You don't think we disagree, Mike?
No, Pete, I think we disagree a lot. And I always appreciate our ability to get to a point of reconciliation while exploring the issues. I do.
That's right. Okay, that's a good way of putting it.
I like my jousting with you. It's always fun.
That's right. Well, so one of the reasons why, Mike, I wanted you on the podcast is Leadership Shock is really designed to help a leader in the moment, right? So right at the moment, it gets them to think holistically about their ecosystem, and it gets them to think about their role and the value they provide to help them identify their priorities, their focus, and the way they want to lead. But you've exposed me over the last year or so to another way to think about leadership, which is this concept of vertical leadership development. So that sounds very academic-y. So talk to me about vertical leadership development and why you think that's really important for leaders as they transition through spots in their career.
Yeah, let's unpack some of the academic piece without getting too academic. So the way that I like to think about leadership vertical development is really using a concept that we call the leadership aperture. And what we mean by that is how much information is the leader letting into their system at any given moment. So you can imagine a leader with a very narrow aperture is not allowing a lot of information in. The wider the aperture gets, the more information they're letting into their decision making in any given moment. And the idea of vertical development is, okay, a leader goes through, over the course of their career, they develop the ability to operate with a wider and wider aperture. So they essentially build either muscles or skills, if you will, to be able to open their aperture wider at any given moment. And the idea here is tracking that and paying attention to their ability to operate with a wide aperture or a wider aperture at any given moment is a really useful way to look at that leader's growth and development. Now, of course, it opens up some really interesting avenues because once you've built the ability to open up your aperture really wide, which, for example, would lend itself to visionary thinking if you go to the widest aperture, you don't always want to be operating at that level, right? So the goal is to be able to operate at whatever aperture is most appropriate for the task at hand. So there's a real skill in being able to discern, okay, do I want to have a really narrow aperture, which might lend itself to tactical thinking? Or do I want to have, let's call it a medium aperture, which might open up to strategic thinking? Or do I need to go really wide and have a visionary level aperture? It's one thing to build the muscles across all 3 of those or build the capability across all 3 of those, but then it's a whole other thing to figure out, well, which is the most important right now?
So that's really interesting. So help me think through the vice president of a function or a business unit, and I become a C-suite executive. there's a big transition, right? There's a big transition there. So
Yeah.
in the vertical leadership development model, is that opening of the aperture happen when they're a VP before they become a C-suite? Is it agnostic of level? Is it like something that's required at that next level? Talk to me a little bit about how that matches with sort of like career pathing.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that leaders encounter is when they find themselves in a new role where a new leadership aperture that they have not practiced before or they haven't built the capability for is required. Oftentimes what happens is a leader is really good at their current job, and one of the reasons why they're good at their current job is because the aperture that they have developed and that they feel really comfortable with is totally appropriate for that job. So let's say they're at a level where strategic thinking is really, really the key to success at this level. But then they get promoted to the next level, and sure, strategic thinking is part of it, but now they really need to be able to operate as a visionary. And they need to be able to communicate that visionary down to strategists, who then need to communicate the strategy down to tacticians. They might not have built that visionary muscle, and that could be a real shock to the system when every day they're being asked to do visionary type things and they haven't yet built that capability. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it actually really leads into the concept of leadership shock, right? So it might be that when I move up a level and I'm in this space where I'm firefighting, I can't manage my calendar, like my team is confused, that's leadership shock. And so what's interesting about the vertical development model is that it may not be, well, it'll be linked to your priorities and the way that you lead, but the driver might be you're trying to take in information at a scope that you've just never done before, and that
Yeah.
is just a muscle that you haven't developed.
Yeah, there's actually two phenomenon. I think that the book, as much as I've read so far, the book really speaks to two phenomenon that occur. One of them is under stress, under pressure, we tend to narrow our aperture, which makes good logical sense, right? We always hear the idea of tunnel vision when you're in a life-threatening crisis situation, and it's a biological response. Your aperture narrows, and it focuses on the things that your brain and your body deem to be the most important for survival, right? It's a survival mechanism. So when a leader finds themselves in a situation where they're being asked to do things that they haven't practiced and they're not very good at, their aperture naturally narrows, right? Which is actually exacerbating the problem, because in this case they're being asked to do wider aperture stuff, and their inclination is to narrow the aperture. And the most common descriptor of when that happens, Pete, is the firefighting. Right? You've got this leader who says, I'm in a constant firefighting mode. Firefighting, we often use actually fire departments as the exemplar of how do you move from tactical to strategic to visionary. The most tactical example of firefighting is literally the folks who jump off the trucks and they're putting out the fire on somebody's house. Right. That's the analogy. Like when you are narrowed your aperture, you feel like you're firefighting, right? So that was something that in the book it really resonated with me. And the other thing that you spoke to in the book that I thought was really cool and appropriate was the notion when a leader is experiencing leadership shock, they don't realize that that's what's happening, right? There's this. They're looking at the world through their lens, and to them it just feels like life. Now it might feel like it's hard, but they don't realize that they're in a state of shock. And that's actually what happens when a leader encounters an aperture requirement that is wider than they have. Like, I'm used to being strategic, which is medium, but all of a sudden the job is asking me to be visionary, which is wider. They don't really understand what's happening. They just know that it's terrible. They know that they're not getting the results that they want. They know that they're not succeeding, but they don't know why. And it's because many leaders lack this aperture language to even begin to broach the subject. So I'm curious to get your reaction. Does that feel like I'm correctly applying?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's one of the key differences. In fact, in the authentic leadership model, it comes through with like the role. So one of the inputs is what's your role, and what you're saying is, and this is what we talk about in the book, is your role is not your job description, right? Your role is what does the organization expect of you?
Yeah.
And then partnered with that is what's your vision for what you're trying to do. And I think that vision piece, I think both of those without explicitly talking about it, get to the concept of vertical development and aperture, because what the organization expects me to be is I used to be like keeping my, like my finger on the pulse. I knew what everyone was doing in my team. Like I knew, and now I've gone up, and now the role is not to do that. The role is actually to connect across the organization. Well, that requires a different level of information that I have to take in. And so I think it sits there in the role along with the vision. So I think that fits. But I'd love to get, as an experienced coach and some, an expert in this vertical development model, when you come across a leader that is in that, that space, and I would actually argue, Mike, that yes, from strategist to visionary is a tough step. Although I don't think there are many organizations that expect their people to be truly visionary, right, even at the C-suite. So they're still probably mostly strategists. I actually think where leadership shock often happens is when I go from like the tactician doing the stuff, my expertise, and I have to start being a leader and thinking strategically. How do you help leaders work through that transition, which can be so challenging?
Yeah, it's a big question. The concept of leadership aperture is, we have found it to actually be even more useful than the labels of tactical strategy and vision, because of exactly what you just described, Pete. The notion of vision often feels very lofty, and how much time can I really spend in that space, and if I'm not Elon Musk, right? But if you take away those labels and you just think of it as an aperture, in other words, how much information am I allowing into my system, suddenly it becomes wildly applicable. And to your point, when a leader moves from being an expert, where they are valued for the knowledge they have, the ability to answer, hard questions or solve hard problems, and you widen the aperture a little bit to say, okay, your job is no longer to answer the questions. Your job is now to lead the people who are answering the questions. Your job is no longer to focus on the cause and effect solutions. Your job is to look at the processes that are causing the causes and the effects. And if you wanted to widen the aperture even further, it'd be to focus on the context that's creating the processes that are creating the cause and effect. So suddenly, just the notion of the wider aperture becomes more applicable. But what I find in working with a leader is sometimes it makes sense for us to go all the way to the most discrete thing that they do, which is, in many cases, conversations with people. Tell me about how you have a conversation that matters with a stakeholder that matters to you. And you would be amazed at how narrow some of these really sophisticated leaders, when you really talk about how they approach a conversation, it becomes very clear to them that they're approaching that conversation with a narrow aperture, and that's getting in their way.
But this is really interesting, right? Because I think the concept of conversations and stakeholders and apertures, this is something that I've actually, since I've written the book, because of our interaction, Mike, I'm beginning to bring into the model, because the model is always evolving. But I think this idea of like, how do you have these conversations leads to the authentic leadership model, because it says like, all right, where's your focus? Like, what's important to you? So that should lead to what the conversations you have. But also, what sort of leader do you want to be? And so it sounds like that aperture is limiting the kind of leader that someone might want to be. So we hear this a lot. I want to be an empowering leader. I want to be a servant leader. We hear this a lot. But when you actually go and you engage with their team, then that, like, their directive, they're none of that, right? It's a real challenge. Is that an aperture problem, or could that be an aperture problem? Is that why people can't sometimes fulfill the leadership roles they want?
Yeah, look, we want to be careful about broad brushstroking, right? Because there could be many causes of that problem, but leadership aperture is absolutely one of the most common. We run the risk of, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I don't want to do that.
Yep.
But I don't think you're at risk of doing that. But for sure, like, a leader could feel, for example, very, very strongly, because they've been there, done that, as they're advising their team. They came from that team, right? That's the team they grew out of. So they know the subject matter better than the team, probably. And yet that's not their role anymore. But they want to be a visionary servant leader. But when you look at the servant leader model, what that requires is for that leader to surrender their expertise and to be a servant. But that's not the thing that they're an expert in, right? And
Right.
the idea of opening the leadership aperture to create space for these other ideas and for this other knowledge, you really have to be a learner. To open your leadership aperture is opening yourself to uncertainty, right? And that's terrifying for most of us, right? Like the idea of like, I'm getting paid to know stuff, right? And to be certain of things. And that you know as well as I do, at the later stages of leadership, things are unknowable, right? Cause and
Yeah.
effect no longer make sense. They don't work that way. And if that becomes your job, then you have a whole day of like, I did a bunch of stuff and the effects are going to be felt years from now. That's really
Yeah.
terrifying for many people. So, I went I went really wide in my answer there, but the reality is leadership aperture, challenging a leader to say, okay, how much information are you letting into your system? How curious are you being in this moment? How open to the other person's perspective? You and I, Pete, often talk about wicked problems where there's no right answer per se. If you're sitting there holding the notion that you have the right answer to whatever problem we're trying to solve, that's a pretty narrow aperture. Because what if I have an answer that's slightly better than yours, or what if neither of us have the right answer and it's actually unknown to both of us? Like that's a widening of the aperture, right? So yeah, I do think leadership aperture explains a lot. And when you give the leader that model and you just say to them, hey, what kind of aperture are you using right now? Once I developed the shorthand with a client, in fact, we put kind of nifty labels on it. From narrow to wide, it would go expert to achiever to catalyst. And that becomes a really fun shorthand for the leaders to play with. I could say to you, hey, Pete, tell me how you're going to approach that conversation with your subordinate that you don't want to go into that conversation because you're a little worried about it. And you would give me your approach, and I'd say, oh, that felt kind of expert to me. What would be an achiever or a catalyst, a little wider approach? And you'd be amazed. Just asking them to do that reframe, they're able to say, "Oh, I get it. Yeah, you're right. I could
Well, I
have a
think,
wider approach."
yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things you talked about, and it's something in another episode on the podcast series with Adam Russell, where we talk about learners and knowers.
Yeah.
And I think that it's, I have, when I do workshops, especially with younger leaders or younger managers, I always say the only thing you need to do to be a great leader or manager is to care. Like if you care, but you probably also need to be open to change and learn, right? So if you care and you learn, you don't need training, you don't need coaching. Those can all accelerate it, but you can get there. But I think in this concept of vertical leadership development, the most important thing is to have humility and be like, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
I want to learn. And that's actually the solution to the wicked problem, right? The solution to the wicked problem is I don't know the answer.
Yep.
So I'm going to try something.
Yep.
And then I will learn from trying that answer.
Yeah.
And so I think that's challenging. Now, this is a leadership shock is really about an executive coaching model, and you're an experienced executive coach. What are the indicators about a client that says they're a learner or says that they're a knower?
Well, if they're in coaching, usually that is a good indicator. And I'm not being flipped there. Like, if a leader is engaging in a coaching process of their own volition, not being sent to the principal's office, like what we at Telos would call derailment coaching or triage coaching, where the leader is really in danger of losing their job and they're told, hey, you must go to this. Sometimes that does happen, right? And sometimes those leaders show up to those engagements and they really do genuinely want to learn, and they can be learners, but sometimes they don't. But if a person is in coaching, generally speaking, that's a good sign that they are a learner, because the coaching process is very much about drawing from within, and it's about challenging and learning. Really, what you find, when a person is a knower as opposed to a learner, they tend to want to do most of the talking, right? In conversation, when they're leading their team, they tend to be the people who feel like it's my job to orchestrate success. In vertical development, we have a very kind of fun phrase that we call heroic and post heroic. Now, I wish there was a better name for post heroic, but you probably get what I mean when I say heroic. So when a leader shows up as a heroic leader, those tend to be associated with the earlier stages of development, maybe the first two stages. And the idea there is that leader feels accountable for winning, right? Whatever winning might look like. They might think it's about the team winning, or the organization winning. They might not be totally narcissistic in me winning. They might even have a pretty, broad stakeholder definition of winning, but they feel it's their job to win, right? It's almost like the team is on their back. They're going to be the ones who are making the big moves and the big plays. They might not even want to take credit for everything. They might have enough sensibility to be like, oh, I want to give away the accolades, but they still feel like it's their race to win, right? It's their moves that are going to make the difference. Whereas a post-heroic leader, they know that's all nonsense, right? They know that it's nothing that they do is going to make a win. They might have a good day and they might make a good comment here and there and be like, wow, that was pretty smart of me to say that. But they know in the end, they are not the winner, right? Pete, you and I have had conversations about, the rugby idea, and I'm fascinated by the idea that the rugby coach can't possibly be the winner, right? The game is so rigged against the rugby coach being the winner. It kind of is really analogous to post-heroic leadership. I don't know. You and I have probably never talked about heroic, post-heroic. I'm curious if that lands for you, that notion.
It does. I mean, I'm now like going through my Rolodex of previous leaders. I think it's very hard to be post-heroic in the modern C-suite leadership society, right? Like you say, Apple was successful because of Steve Jobs, right? When Steve Jobs didn't invent anything, right? He was a very good leader, but he didn't invent anything. He wasn't an amazing innovator. He got the right innovators in the room, and he was able to identify what was right about it. But that's not how people talk. They talk about him being a great innovator and it's just, so I do wonder how much leaders are conditioned by by society. And look, we can look at, CEO pay, and you can look at CEO pay, and there's people are paying the CEOs a lot of money.
Yep.
To be post-heroic, to not feel like what they do is impactful. Like, how does, like, that's a tough transition to go on.
It's paradoxical. I would go so far as to say it's paradoxical, and ironically, paradox is a late stage post heroic phenomenon. Leaders who have not really experienced that wide aperture looking at the world, paradox scares the crap out of them, because they're like, what do you mean I don't know? What do you mean two things that are in opposition can be true at the same time? That doesn't work. So yeah, you're right. Post heroic leadership is paradoxical. And Pete, I would say that many leaders that I've worked with and that I know you've worked with, they can feel that too, and they know there's a shred of truth in there. Now, maybe not. Maybe we're not asking them to become, the poster child of post heroism, right? Like, but they can identify the micro moments where they can make a post heroic move, and I think that's the best that most of us can do, right? Is really challenging yourself to say, okay, am I being a bit heroic here when I really should be post-heroic? Am I being medium aperture when I really could do wide? And just having those kind of conversations with yourself. You said something earlier, and I wanted to put a pin in it. The late stage leadership is incredibly frustrating. So I'm told. It's incredibly frustrating because you are never certain of anything. Right? It just an hour ago before this call, I was on a conversation with the CEO of a pretty large manufacturing organization, and he was saying, well, Mike, at a certain stage, you never know whether you're right or wrong. Like, and you have to decide, Mike, what you're saying to me is I have to decide, do I show up as narrow aperture, medium aperture, or wide aperture? How do I know? And I said, you never know. That's the paradox. You never know, but you have to go. Right? You have to make a decision at some point in time. And I said, the thing that I would want for you as a leader is to always ask yourself, might I be wrong? Right? I still have to make a decision, but I might be wrong. Right? So you're holding this humility of, I'm going to go tactical on this one because I feel like I need to get the team over the finish line and I feel like it's going to be me who does it. But I should very much say, am I wrong here? Am I making the right decision? And I think as long as you're going through that humility check, like that questioning of yourself over and over again, I think you're okay. Like, to me, that's the best you can do, is just always be in that mode of, am I doing the right thing here? Because I think as soon as you think you're always doing the right thing, you're probably gone.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that you talked about earlier in the discussion is this idea of like a leader should be able to move up and down that continuum from tactician through strategist to visionary.
Yeah.
And that actually, if I'm a CEO and I say, I'm going to do this tactical thing, I actually know what the outcome is because that's going to be very tactical. Right. And so, and so I'm going to come in and I'm going to personally move the team or move the organization in a certain way. Strategically, when I'm in that space, there's more uncertainty. I think I know what's going to happen because we've thought about it.
Yep.
I think in that visionary space, I think what you called catalyst, that's where we're working with an organization right now to develop a new purpose and values. They don't know what the outcome of those purpose and values is going to be in their culture. They believe it's going to be better. We believe it's going to be better. It's going to be more unified, but they actually can't identify this. Now the organization is going to be like this. That's when you get into that unknown. That's really what you're talking about. It's like, we're going to do these leadership values. We think it's going to improve the organization, but we actually don't know how it's going to do it. And we also don't know which of these many interventions we're going to do are actually going to be impactful. Right. And that's the not knowing at that visionary piece and the culture and the really big picture stuff. Yep. It's you don't know, but you have to use your experience and the right people around you. And then, and in most cases, if you commit to something, it's going to have an impact. It's going to improve things. You can't say how much it's going to improve it. We're not committing to things are not going to improve things, right? So it is about making choice and making a strong choice.
Yeah, there's a real courage move there as well, because imagine yourself, Pete, being brought into a turnaround situation, right? You're the newly installed CEO in a failing organization. There's going to be tremendous pressure to have results quickly, right? Which implies a degree of tactical decision making. So that leader is going to have to do some of that stuff, right? And they know for sure if they're good at this kind of turnaround thing, they're going to be able to look at this organization. They're going to be able to say, there's some process issues which are strategic, but whoa, there's some cultural stuff going on here. Some real context level meta stuff going on here that if we don't fix that meta stuff, these other levels are going to always just keep coming back. Right. And that leader is going to have to your point, make strong choices at all three of those levels. And the ones at the top are going to be real scary because the return on that investment is not obvious. Right. To your point with the organization that is doing the values and culture work, when are they going to get the return? Pete, they're hiring consultants. When are they going to get their ROI? Like,
right.
Tell me when. Like, show me on the calendar. When are they going to get the ROI? Right. There's no way the leader of that organization would ever ask you that question, right? Because they know they're not going to get the ROI next week, right? That leader, whatever leader is embarking upon that journey, they know that some questions are not going to be answered, in the next year. They might even know that some of these questions might not be answered in this lifetime, right? They might be playing a many generations game of who do we want to be as an organization,
right.
And they're willing to make those investments because they're real, like at the dollar level. Like those investments are real.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
There's a real courage there.
Yeah, no, and I think I work with another coach, John Kumlili, who's a sports psychologist at the University of Illinois Chicago. I think you've met John, very interesting guy. And when I was coaching the national team, you would also come across these choices that you didn't know what the outcomes would be, right? Whether it was, we're going to play New Zealand or England, and we haven't played this game 100 times to be able to work out what the best choice is. We have this one game that we don't know the outcome for, and we're using all of our experience to be able and data to be able to come in and try and make those right choices. And John would always ask, what's the strong choice? Which is really what's the courageous choice? Because as leaders, as leaders, there are multiple choices that we could make, but there's almost always a strong choice. When you get asked what's the strong choice, you're like, oh, the strong choice is this.
Yeah.
And then John would say, okay, so why wouldn't you do that? If that's the strong choice, let's argue against it.
Right.
Why wouldn't you do it? And if you didn't have a good argument against the strong choice, then it became the only choice.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about this concept of courage and choice. Yeah. And I think those are really challenging for leaders as they like move up in the organization.
Yeah, I love that. If you'll indulge me, I want to take it like all the way back down to that discrete level, because I think what you just did there kind of points to a really interesting practical application. Imagine you're a senior leader who's got a person underneath them who is struggling in the job, and your personal opinion is that they're not going to make it. You've assessed them. You just think they're in over their head, and by the way, they're not going to make it to where they need to be in a reasonable amount of time. So, in other words, your intuition is telling you that this person needs to go. However, you don't know that, right? You just think that. So, having that conversation with that person could be really awkward, right? That could be a really difficult conversation, a pivotal conversation. I think many leaders would avoid that conversation, or they would show up to that conversation in a way that John would say is not strong, right? I'm going to control the direction of this conversation. I'm not going to ask that other person what they think about whether they're suited for this role or not, because I don't know what they're going to say, right? What if they come back and say, it's all your fault, Mike? Yeah, I'm struggling in this role, but it's all your fault. And then I have to deal with that. Like, who wants any of that, right? So, I'm not going to enter into that total unknown space because it's scary, right? So, the strong move would be, the wide aperture move would be, you have to be curious with that person. Maybe that person is
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, but you could feel at a tactical level, like on a conversational level, how this wide aperture can really show up. It's like, if I show up to that meeting, wide aperture, I want to know your opinion, and in fact, I want to lead with your opinion, right?
Right.
I have no idea where that's going to go.
This is actually back to this tactical piece around feedback, right? So even if this person isn't, even if they might be able to make it and I have to give them feedback, I always encourage my clients, the first thing you do is you want to learn. What do they think? Most people know if they're not doing a good job. Now, you have to be really careful about the questions you ask, right? Asking the right questions. But if you ask the right questions, to your point, you open the aperture of information. Now I have information where I can actually deal with the feedback. And it's interesting, I was with a group last week and we were talking about this, and people are always like, I don't like giving feedback because I don't want to hurt their feelings. I'm like, no, you don't want to give feedback because it's hard for you. Like that's why you don't want to give feedback. You're saying it's because you don't want them to, you don't want to hurt their feelings, but actually it's because it's hard for you to give. And because it's hard for you to give, then and that's where you get to the strengths, right? And the courage. It takes courage to give difficult feedback. I mean, and I'll come back to as long as it's in a caring way, the person that's on my team that isn't going to make it, that person, if they're not going to make it, the sooner they know about it, the better off they will be.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
The sooner I can help them see this isn't their career or isn't right for them, the better off I will be. And I will even say, we're working with another client and in their, they have a value of kindness, and kindness is being honest to someone. Right. Yeah. And so you're not being kind if you're protecting that underperforming employee from the truth about their performance.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, it's a real shift there. Let's talk about feedback, because feedback is another really practical way to see vertical development. And I'll go back to the expert, achiever, catalyst model. The three apertures there. The expert, their relationship to feedback usually goes like this. They'll take feedback when it's received, and oftentimes, depending if they're a mature expert or an immature expert, if they're an immature expert, they'll generally resist the feedback. They'll dismiss it. If they're a sophisticated expert, they'll take on the feedback and they'll get better to advance their expertise. The achiever level will be a little bit more open to feedback. They'll be more likely to act on it. They might ask for it from time to time, but they're not going to go out of their way to get feedback. They're going to be open to it, but they're not going to go out of their way. Whereas the catalyst is aggressively seeking feedback. they're aggressively asking for feedback. And I'm not going to pay you many compliments in your lifetime, Pete, but that is one area that you've actually shown. Like, I notice a difference between my approach to feedback and yours in my being with you. You aggressively ask for feedback about your performance all the time. You do it reliably. I don't know, where you got that habit from, but you are really good at asking yourself for feedback, and you're actually quite good at delivering feedback as well. But I've really appreciated your asking for feedback, because I am not. Like, my aperture is not as wide as yours as it relates to feedback, and that's just a real. I mean, it's clearly better to operate the way you do. It just is.
Yeah.
I see it every day, and I'm like, I should do that more often. And yet, it's hard. I don't.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I gave recently gave a plenary talk at KPMG at Ready Set Grow, which is a program that we've partnered on at the firm, and and feedback was really important. And I think my view of feedback has completely come from my experience of coaching elite level sport. Because elite level sport, like the only thing the elite athlete gets is feedback. Like that. And so what I say is feedback is the fuel of elite performance. Like, if you don't get feedback, and especially at that high level where like small gains are really important, therefore feedback becomes really important. That's where I have, like, it's where I learned to give feedback. And when I was coaching, it was two-way, because I didn't want the hierarchy. And so, when I was going to the Olympics, we would have feedback every week, one-on-one with players, right? And then I would ask them, what are we doing? So this is a mutual thing. I want you to get better. I need you to want me to get better. Yep. If we're going to win an Olympic medal, we both have to improve. And so that's really where that feedback that culture of feedback has come from. And to your point, it's that's a place. There are other places, Mike, as you know, that I don't have as wide an aperture, but that's a place I have a wide aperture. And to me, I just need more information to improve my performance. It's a continuous journey. Like, there's no point when I am as good a facilitator, as good a coach, whatever it is, there's no way that journey stops. I can always get better. And that's the approach that I have.
You're kind of leading me into some territory that I think might be interesting for the listeners here. The notion of vertical development, at least the way we've been talking about it, is pretty non-threatening, right? We've been talking about it in very practical terms, because you and I have been working on how to make it practical. The notion of vertical development is not without detractors out there, right? And there's some stuff that might be worth us talking about, because you and I are working really hard to apply the concepts of vertical development in a useful way, but trying to discard some of the stuff that isn't quite as useful. And you're alluding to the idea that a person can have different apertures in different aspects of their life. So another way to say the same thing would be, if there are multiple lines of intelligence, I might have different developmental capacities across those different lines.
Right.
And it gets really squirrely when you start to make correlations, right? Like, if I'm a medium level capacity over here, does that automatically mean I'm more developed on this totally different line of intelligence? And I think that's where the apprehension about vertical development comes in, because people start to feel like, whoa, you're labeling people with levels, and that feels overly simplistic and not very not very representative of the way the world really works. Also, what evidence do you have that it works that way? Like, and there is a lot of research out there, but you of all people have taught me, and I can't remember the name of the book you read, you made me read, but like it suddenly undermined all of my belief in research. I used to kind of think that any science
fiction is the book. Yeah.
Any research had to be good. And then I read science fictions and I was like, oh my God, I don't trust anything anymore. So yeah, there's a lot of research out there that there are correlations, in vertical development, and we can measure these stages, but you have to hold it all very lightly, right? Like it can be unproductive if you try to make too broad of a brushstroke about, labeling stages and assuming that, capacity in this line of intelligence translates to that line of intelligence. It gets to be a pretty slippery slope pretty fast. I don't know if you have
Yeah, but
thoughts on that.
I think, but it's in our business. These are all just tools. There's no
Yeah,
truth, right? And I think that that's the thing. Like these are ways of us being able to talk to help our clients be better at their role.
yeah,
The same way the authentic leadership model is not foolproof, right? It is more holistic than the way most people think,
yep,
but it's not really designed in a way like at no point do I'm like, oh, check the box, you are now done, and this is true,
yep,
right? It is a model, a framework, just like vertical agility is, and so it helps us when we work with our clients to give them a framework to help them improve in their performance,
yeah,
and that's
yeah.
where I think vertical leadership development is really powerful.
Yeah, I agree, and I like the way you said that. You also have opened my mind to thinking about. I love the way you kind of use the analogy of a heat map when it relates to this kind of tactical, strategic, and visionary. Because the traditional vertical model is more. The analogy is more of a think of those Russian nesting dolls, right? Where you've
Right,
got tactical, and then you've got a bigger doll that over encompasses that, and then a bigger one that's the catalyst or the visionary. But that's not actually the way it really works. Like in real life, it's more of a heat map about where are you spending your energy, where are you spending your time? Is it on the tactical, the strategic, or the visionary? And then what's the optimal, right? Or what might be the optimal? What might be a
right.
better?
And what's the optimal for your role? I mean, if you're in your very first management role, acting like a catalyst,
Might not.
even a piece of it,
Yeah,
right, is not going to be useful. And I do think that there are some constraints that organizational culture puts on people that limits their ability to express what might be their natural vertical stage.
yes, and yeah, and that could be a shock to somebody, especially if they're new to an organization.
Absolutely. Like you'll hear this a lot. Like a leader comes in and they'll be like, my boss is all over me all the time about all of these details.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
didn't happen in my old job.
yep,
Yeah, that's the culture. The
yeah,
culture is
yeah.
everyone knows what the details are.
Yeah, I have a story. It was about a year and a half ago. We were brought in. Telos was brought in to work with an organization, and they had brought. It was a family run organization, a family legacy, and they had brought in the heir apparent to that organization. And in my meeting that person, I realized how sophisticated or how wide of an aperture this particular individual operated from, and it was in stark contrast to everyone else around. So this person was operating from a really, really wide aperture, a catalyst level aperture, and all of the people around him were operating from expert, maybe achiever, so kind of medium to narrow aperture. And he was really, really struggling mightily, but he was showing up with all this humility, and he was just really sad. Like he was really sad that this wasn't working. But when I would interview his counterparts, they were really angry. Like they were really frustrated with him, but in a way that was much less skillful. Like you could feel him trying to make space for them and them not trying to make space for him. Right? It was a very
Right.
palpable example of aperture. Like, oh, I get it. They can't go that wide. And this particular leader went through one of our vertical models. We use several different models to help a person understand their verticality, if you will. And he saw that and his jaw dropped. He just saw it and he went, whoa, I now know what's happening. I'm doing this, and everyone around me is doing that. And my answer to him was yes. Now, what are you going to do about that? And he said, well, what can I do? Because I can't make them be able to do a wider aperture. And I said, no, you can't. So, what's the only thing you can do when you encounter somebody who has less capability than you or less aperture capability? The only move is compassion, right? You can't you
Right.
can't be you can't wish them to be someone they're not, right?
Right.
So compassion is the move, right? Curiosity is the move when you meet somebody who's got a wider aperture than you. You should be curious and be around them as often as you can. But when you encounter and you're immersed in an environment that is going to punish you for being who you are, he left.
Right.
He left the organization, and it was, heartbreaking. When I say heartbreaking, I say that with every sense of the word. This individual left the family business, and he was the only heir apparent, but he left because he couldn't do it. He said, Mike, I'm not up to that challenge. But he left with total clarity. I mean,
Wow, that's
he
amazing.
left, yeah, he left knowing exactly why he was leaving. And again, it was sadness. He left with sadness. Didn't make it any easier, but he left a wake of frustration, right? And it's just as a person who has this map, to be able to witness all of that and it's just really heartbreaking. And my hope in the world is that that doesn't happen, right? Because to me, if we had just given the map to those other people and invited them to see the beauty of this other leader and the way that they were going about it, and see it not as a threat but as an invitation, who knows what could have happened. But as you and I know, easier said than done, right? The reality of the days are only so long.
That's right.
And the job has to get done, right? That business was running, right? So it was a
Right.
it was a real live business. So you can't play an academic game here. But it was really interesting to watch.
Well, it's an amazing story to finish on. So, Mike, thank you so much. This was a really enlightening. I love our discussions. This is literally, for the listeners, what Mike and I often do when we find ourselves at a client over dinner.
Yeah.
We have these sorts of conversations, but really, really interesting stuff. So, a couple of things just to summarize this idea of leaders have an aperture, an information aperture. You can be intentional about it, and as you grow, you want to find ways in your new role to stay out of leadership shock, find ways to increase your aperture, because any subsequent role is going to ask for you to be a little broader. And then this idea of making matches between, recognizing that one of the reasons why it might be difficult working with a colleague is you're working in those different apertures. So really, really interesting stuff. So you can find Telos, look up the Telos Institute. You can find Mike Herzog, great partners. They've done great work with clients that I've had. Just a reminder for everyone that the book is available through Amazon. You can buy it. It's in the episode notes. I want to thank Mike Herzog from the Telos Institute again for another great almost hour of discussion around leadership. And just a reminder, episodes that are on your favorite podcasting platform, please like, share, leave feedback, and spread the word. And so that is it from myself, Pete Steinberg, and Leadership Shock. And until we hear from you next time.